When Squall Leonhart burst onto the scene as a fresh-faced protagonist back in 1998, there was something inherently unique about not just his visual style, but who he was as a person. Often protagonists in fantasy-based games would be burgeoning heroes who rose up to tackle the big bad and save the world from destruction. As depicted in their stories, this felt like a role they were built for, and they'd fill those shoes with pride, happy to carry the burden of expectation and be the hero or heroes the world needed them to be in that time. Final Fantasy has often classified these heroes as the Warriors of Light, and in many ways Squall was built in that mold, but some of his character traits were at odds with what you'd expect from a typical Warrior of Light. Here we had a protagonist who had a quiet confidence, but due to lots of emotional trauma wanted to stay in the shadows and often just be left alone. This represented a significant change, and this approach resonated with so many individuals who played the game, helping to make Squall a very popular figure. And it's because of this popularity that Squall has been rolled out on numerous occasions within other Final Fantasy games, non-Final Fantasy games, and even wider entertainment properties. It's led to a whole host of trivia being created around Squall, and today we're going to be talking about some of the bits that aren't so well known. And in this regard, we hope they're insightful on multiple levels beyond just being a headline, as that's the main criteria we always try to base our content on. Is there an interesting insight or angle to the wider story? That's why we won't be talking in more detail around more well-known facts like David Boreanaz, aka Angel, being the first actor to give Squall a voice when he appeared in Kingdom Hearts before then being replaced by Doug Erholtz, or that there's a subtle reference to Squall within the English localization of Final Fantasy IX. What we're going to start with instead is something that relates to the localization of Final Fantasy VIII that has a subtle impact on how you might view Squall as a character. But I'd like to recommend you stick around until the end of the video to see what Yoshinori Kitase, the director of Final Fantasy VIII, revealed was his biggest regret about the character. I'd also like to take the time to let you know that we've partnered up with Itaikuji, an awesome Japanese retailer, to get you discounts on your orders. They have an extensive range of merchandise that covers numerous franchises, but from our perspective, they sell items that are often exclusive to the Square Enix Cafe in Tokyo, as well as other things like the Final Fantasy VII Remake Ultimania guidebooks. Lauren and I have used Itaikuji ourselves numerous times, which is why we're so excited to share this partnership with you all. To take advantage yourselves, visit itaikuji.com and use the code FFUnion300 at checkout to get 300 yen off your first order. So Squall has become well known for his short, sharp, and often cold responses. This behaviour was evidenced numerous times throughout the game, as Squall either voiced his displeasure about what was being spoken about, or we were privy to his internal thoughts on the matter. But one of the more interesting nuances about his behaviour is that there are subtle differences in terms of its execution when comparing the English and Japanese versions of the game, and this was something brought to light by Legends of Localization. In the English version of Final Fantasy VIII, whenever Squall was disinterested in a particular subject, he would often respond by saying or thinking, "whatever." It's become his catchphrase, and it's assumed that Squall was using this phrase in a dismissive tone, making it, more often than not, come across as rather rude, but in a comical way, at least to the player. In the Japanese version, Squall had a much larger array of phrases he used to voice his disinterest, and in that regard, he was also often much more cutting. One of the earlier times this happened was when Quistis was escorting Squall through the fire cavern. Attempting to flirt with her student, Quistis joked that boys often get choked up when she accompanies them on the mission, as her charm makes them nervous. In the English version, Squall just looks at her and thinks, "whatever," as in, "yeah, right." But in the Japanese version, Squall looks at her and instead thinks, "I can't believe this teacher." Later, at the dance, Quistis chides Squall for his willingness to dance with a complete stranger just so that he can avoid dancing with her. Again, in the English version, he responds by saying, "whatever," but in the Japanese version he says, "warakata na," which can be translated as a sarcastic, "my bad," or an insincere, "sorry." Another example is in the forest when Rinoa criticizes Squall for his behavior. Instead of thinking whatever, he instead thinks the equivalent of, "man, you're annoying," or "get off my case." These are subtle changes, but they do help to give Squall a bit more personality by showing some deviation. In total, there are 15 separate instances where Squall either thinks or says whatever throughout the game, and in the Japanese version, he often has a different response each time. If you have the time, I'd encourage you to check out the full study that Legends of Localization did on this particular localization decision. There's a link in the description below. Something that is consistent across all language variants of Final Fantasy VIII is Squall's name. And although that might sound obvious, there are many instances throughout the franchise where characters have had their names changed to make them more attuned to what various audiences around the world might expect to see or hear. Often, when characters then reappear elsewhere in other properties, they retain their original name. But when Squall appeared in Kingdom Hearts, his name was changed from Squall to Leon, and this connected him with another character in the Final Fantasy franchise, Leon from Final Fantasy II. What makes this connection very special though, is that Leon from Final Fantasy II was not given that name when it was released in Japan back in 1988. He was instead called Leonhart, a very interesting and intentional choice, as it was a clear deviation from the traditional English word Lionheart and how that would be represented in Japanese. Leon was also called Leonhart in the English NES prototype called Final Fantasy II Dark Shadow over Palakia, which was never released. To my knowledge, it's never been divulged why this change was made. In Japan, these two characters still exist as Leonhart and Squall Leonhart, but maybe the developers thought audiences outside of Japan would get confused by two characters in the mainline series having almost the exact same name, especially as this could lead to suggestions that an association might exist between them. That would make a degree of sense, as in 2003, when Final Fantasy II was released outside of Japan for the first time, numerous fan theories had started to be created that were attempting to connect the various Final Fantasy worlds. And Square Enix even stoked some of those theories themselves when they named a character Shinra in Final Fantasy X-2. Then again, Squall had already been renamed as Leon in Kingdom Hearts before the localized version of Final Fantasy II was released, and although that was a different franchise, it was clearly the same character, and this perhaps slipped through the cracks as Square were going through a lot of change themselves around that time due to the merger with Enix. If we're sticking with that thought though, Squall was the only Final Fantasy character to go through such a transition, with every other character retaining their original name for their appearance in Kingdom Hearts. Within the narrative, it was explained that following the destruction of his world by the Heartless, Squall had changed his name to Leon to distance himself from his past and make a fresh start. But in reality, his name change was also a symbolic gesture. When Squall was being conceived, Tetsuya Nomura designed Squall with long hair and an elegant, feminine appearance, and he did this having been inspired by the actor River Phoenix. Yoshinori Kitase saw the design, but did not approve of the direction Nomura had taken and requested that Squall be redrawn with shorter hair and a more masculine look. Nomura proceeded with the request, and that redraw ended up being the basis for what we saw in the final product, but he still held on to his original vision for the character, and when the opportunity arrived to surface that vision, he took the chance. Serving as both the director and character designer of Kingdom Hearts, which would feature original characters alongside existing characters from Final Fantasy and Disney properties, Nomura decided that Squall should be one of the crossover characters, but instead of using the final design from Final Fantasy VIII, he instead reverted back to his original vision for Squall. Realizing this could lead to some misaligned expectations, the decision was also made to change his name. As Nomura explained in the Kingdom Hearts Ultimania, if people saw in the beginning that Meet Squall was written in the letter, people would have an image of Squall in their head and the impact of that first meeting would be weak. It was for that reason that Jun Akiyama proposed that they change Squall's name, as this will create some distance between people's expectations of Squall based on his appearance in Final Fantasy VIII. We're next going to focus on some unique traits exhibited by Squall's limit break, Renzokuken. When this limit break was first seen within the Final Fantasy VIII demo, it was known as Sea Sword. This served as a reference to the literal Japanese translation of the word Renzokuken, which means continuous sword. But in both instances, the basic implementation remained the same. Squall would rush forward, striking the proposed enemy numerous times, and the player could press R1 at the designated timing points to deal critical strikes. But there were numerous mechanics at play under the hood that would determine how effective Renzokuken was. One of those mechanics was Crisis Level. This would take into consideration any status effects that the character had been afflicted with, their current HP compared to their maximum HP, and how many allies were KO'd when it was their turn. In the case of Squall, Crisis level would determine how many times Renzokuken would strike the enemy, and it would also influence the probability of it being followed by one of Squall's finishing blows. If the situation was bad, but not too bad, then Squall would perform 4 strikes, but if the situation seemed dire, then this would be increased to 7. There was also a 50% chance that an additional strike could be added onto the end, making Renzokuken strike 8 times. Outside of Crisis level, unlike other limit breaks in Final Fantasy VIII, Renzokuken was also affected by circumstance, and by that, I mean that it would change when fighting against certain enemies. For example, should Squall perform a limit break against Jumbo Cactuar, you would get a unique 7-hit variant of Renzokuken that had Squall jumping around on its head. But if Renzokuken was performed in the fight against Bahamut, Squall would perform a 6-hit variant that would see him utilising Bahamut's wings as part of the attack sequence. In total, there were 11 fights throughout Final Fantasy VIII that would see unique variants of Renzokuken used, and some of the most powerful and coolest looking appeared against the various forms of Ultima Seer. Now, due to his popularity, Squall has appeared in numerous cameo roles outside of Kingdom Hearts. He's been a mainstay in the various mobile games produced by Square Enix over the years, and is often the de facto representative for Final Fantasy VIII in tribute and anniversary games. Each of these appearances is often quite predictable, but Squall's first cameo appearance was anything but. Back in 1998, Square decided to try and leverage the popularity of games such as Mario Kart and Diddy Kong Racing by producing their own kart racing game. And to ensure it succeeded, much as Nintendo had done, they decided to have their kart racing game serve as an extension of an existing property. The obvious choice would have been Final Fantasy, but in 1997, Square had produced a successful spin-off from the brand called Chocobo's Mystery Dungeon. This ventured into a brand new genre, serving as a roguelike instead of the traditional role-playing game, and it gave Square confidence that this new sub-brand could be built out. After the release of Chocobo's Mystery Dungeon, a sequel was given the green light, but so was a breeding and racing simulator called Chocobo Stallion, a board game called Dice de Chocobo, a mini-game associated with Final Fantasy VIII called Chocobo World, and a racing game called Chocobo Racing. This would feature numerous hallmarks of the Final Fantasy franchise, and the default racer lineup included a Chocobo, Black Mage, White Mage, Bahamut, a Behemoth, and even Mog from Chocobo's Mystery Dungeon. But there were also plenty of secret races, including but not limited to Ayabrea from Parasite Eve, Cloud Strife, and Squall. What made Squall unique, however, was that unlike every other secret character, he was the only one to feature a custom portrait, and this elevated him by comparison, making his appearance a bit more special. Working with the comical nature of Chocobo Racing, Squall drove the Tempest. This was the car he used in Dealing City when attempting to assault Sorceress Adia, and just like in the FMV sequence, this kart featured great speed, acceleration and turning, but didn't have the best brakes. Squall also had a retroactive appearance in an older Final Fantasy game. As the franchise has built out, Square Enix has often chosen to insert fresh illusions when re-releasing some of the older games that first appeared on the NES and SNES. Gilgamesh, for example, appeared in Final Fantasy I and II Dawn of Souls, despite his first chronological appearance being in Final Fantasy V, and he also appeared in Final Fantasy VI Advance as an Esper. As noted in our facts video about Sephiroth, both he and Cloud Strife appeared in cameo roles for the re-release of Final Fantasy V as part of the Final Fantasy V anthology. It saw them both occasionally appear as 2D sprites during loading screens, and it was adorable. Final Fantasy VI also featured in the anthology release, and it featured a similar style of cameo, except instead of Sephiroth or Cloud, the object of the illusion was Squall. For this particular iteration, Squall was given a more diverse array of sprites, and he was even shown to be sleeping in quite a few of them. But unlike Final Fantasy V, where 2 characters appeared from the same game, in Final Fantasy VI, Squall was the only one to appear in this manner. But as adorable as that is, it's now time to move on to our last interesting morsel of information, and it relates to Yoshinori Kitase's biggest regret about Squall. Throughout development, significant effort was placed on attempting to make the players feel connected with Squall. In the past, when it came to character motivations, much more was left down to interpretation. But by allowing players to hear Squall's thoughts and feelings, it gave them an inside line. It's why Squall's character growth felt much more natural, as you got to see his struggles and you also got to see how he worked to overcome them. Central to this was the inclusion of numerous sequences that would challenge Squall, forcing him into uncomfortable positions. But these didn't always relate to difficult physical encounters, as there were numerous scenes related to awkward social situations too. One of the most infamous is the Fisherman's Horizon concert. In-game, this sequence was masterminded by Rinoa so that she could spend some quality time with Squall. But even though this scene feels quite innocent on the surface, there's one aspect that Kitase wishes he had not included, as it showed a side of Squall that he now feels was inappropriate. As the concert progressed, Rinoa attempted to seem endearing by affectionately imitating Squall. Unimpressed, Squall raised his hand and attempted to strike Rinoa. She ended up dodging, but Kitase revealed that he regretted pushing for this scene to be included. When speaking with Game Informer as part of his promotional duties surrounding the release of Final Fantasy VIII Remastered Edition, Kitase noted that other staff members, including scenario writer Kazushige Nojima, had objected to the scene's inclusion, but he ignored these objections and included the scene anyway. With hindsight, Kitase now wishes he had listened to his staff and not included that particular scene, as it could easily be perceived the wrong way. But yeah, with that, I think we're done. They were 7 facts about Squall Leonhart that we feel you probably didn't know, and as always, we threw in a boatload of little facts for good measure. Nonetheless, I'm sure there are still some amongst you who knew all of them. Let us know in the comments below though which one you found the most interesting, and of course, if you enjoyed the video, please be sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Alright guys, this is Daryl signing out. A big thanks to all of our Patreon and YouTube membership supporters, and of course, a big thanks to all of you for watching this video. I hope to see you all again soon for more Final Fantasy goodness.